Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Decarbonization in the United States, Implications for India Country. We're grateful to our moderator, Dr. Anna Ebers, and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among individuals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the organization, we encourage you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please use Zoom's Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to make known your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar and to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Anna Ebers Broughel, energy economist and statistician at Tetra Tech. Anna is also a council member of the United States Association for Energy Economics. Anna, over to you.
Thank you for a kind introduction, Dave. Thank you, IAE, for hosting this webinar on this very important topic of energy justice and energy access, not in Native American communities in the US. As we know, decarbonization is currently a huge topic, as it should be. However, the question is how we're able to decarbonize every part of the US and not leave anybody behind. Today, you're in for a treat. We have 3 wonderful speakers that bring a breadth of knowledge spanning multiple decades. And first, it's my pleasure to introduce Clark Miller. Is a director at the Center for Energy and Society and a professor in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society at Arizona State University. He's also a member of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Committee on Accelerating Decarbonization in the US. And today, Clark will present a recent report that the academies have published and discuss how this will apply to Native American nations in the US. Second speaker is Maggie Tallmadge. Maggie manages Ranger Power's energy marketing efforts and the development of solar power projects. Prior to joining Ranger, she worked at the Coalition of Communities of Color. And prior to that, she was on the Public Utility Commission to leading legislative, electoral, and other policy and campaigns. She served on the Board of Governors for the Oregon Citizens Utility Board and was a commissioner on the City of Portland Planning and Sustainability Commission. To share her thoughts, I would also like to point out that Maggie is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and she has published her thoughts on what energy transition means for the Native Americans in a series of publications online. So if you just Google Maggie's name, this will come up. Now, last but not least, Chéri Smith. Chéri is an entrepreneur. She started Covenant Solar Initiative in 2017. And prior to funding this initiative, she was leading workforce strategy for Tesla. She is an alumni of Solar City and has been responsible for projects on the Standing Rock and in Northern Cheyenne and the Navajo reservations. And prior to being at Solar City, Chéri also worked at ACORE, American Council on Renewable Energy. Thank you for joining us online. It's a pleasure to see you all. And without further ado, I'm going to yield the floor to Clark. Go ahead, Clark.
Thank you, Anna. It's great to be here this morning with Maggie and with Chéri. A great pleasure to have the chance to speak to you alongside of them. Can you all see my slides? Great. Let me just get everything organized. So I want to start this morning by acknowledging that the land I am on is part of the historical homeland of the O'odham peoples. It is also particularly important, I feel, given today's topic, to acknowledge that Indian country has played a key role in the history of the US energy system, and especially in powering the growth of Phoenix and Arizona, often via the exploitation of indigenous land, water, resources, labor, and bodies, neither adequately compensated nor creating the conditions that would allow the people of Indian country to leverage their contributions to the region's and the nation's prosperity to secure their own sovereignty or futures. I think this is particularly important as we think about decarbonization, both with respect to the kinds of opportunities that we're going to hear about from Maggie and Chéri, and also because of the challenges that Indian country is already facing with regard to the decarbonization agenda. I think many of you will be familiar, of course, with the long-running discussions now surrounding the closure of Navajo Generating Station and also the additional challenges with respect to coal-fired generation going forward. As some of you will undoubtedly already be aware, last month we released a new report from the National Academies from the Committee on Accelerating Decarbonization of the US Energy System. And in that report, we lay out a pathway by which the United States can achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. And we draw two critical conclusions in that report. First, we conclude that decarbonization by 2050 is technically feasible. And I want to articulate a little bit about what that means. The graph on your left, the straight line from where we are today to where we need to be in 2050 to achieve decarbonization is not meant to be representative of anything in particular, except that that's the path that we need to be on in order to get to net zero by 2050. The blue area, which as you can see is where most of the action is carbon dioxide emissions from the energy sector in the United States. The orange is other greenhouse gas emissions, and the gray are land sinks of carbon dioxide. And so you can see that while there is some capacity there for the US land sinks to take up carbon dioxide, most of that is covered by other non-CO2 greenhouse gases. And so to get to net neutrality by 2050, we have to nearly eliminate all CO2 emissions from the energy sector. Our other conclusion, and I'll talk a little bit more about the technologies in a minute to do that, but the other conclusion that we draw is that decarbonization by 2050 is financially affordable. And I think this is one of our important conclusions. And you can see in the graph on the right what we mean by that. And that is that what you're looking at is a percentage of energy system spending as a fraction of the US GDP. And the blue line is, of course, the historical data on that. You can see that number has come down over the years. It wiggles around a fair bit, but what you see on the right from 2020 on are a series of projections from different studies that we reviewed as part of our work that show projections of energy spending that will be required in order to achieve carbon neutrality. That's the blue and the purple and the orange in comparison to reference cases from the Energy Information Administration. And you can see that what's expected going forward in order to achieve decarbonization is in fact a small increase in overall spending compared to the business as usual cases but it remains well within the range of total spending as a fraction of GDP for the United States as a whole. So let me move on here to the technology goals. In the report, we make a number of technology and policy recommendations for what the US federal government should do between 2020 and 2030. And I think this is an important piece of of what this report does that you should be aware is we're focused on this first decade of what will be a 3-decade transition. And what's required from the US federal government to put the country on the path to deep decarbonization. And those recommendations are designed to advance a suite of technology goals for the US energy sector, none of which I suspect is terribly surprising. And so you can see that we put forward a set of goals related to electrification of energy services in transportation, buildings, and industry, including, for example, moving half of vehicle sales to electric vehicles by 2030 and deploying heat pumps in 1/4 of residences. We recognize, of course, that in order to decarbonize the US energy system, we must produce large amounts of carbon-free electricity. And so we call for roughly doubling the share of electricity generated by carbon-free sources from 37 to 75%. We call for improving energy efficiency and productivity, expanding the innovation toolkit, including spending, tripling federal support for net zero RD&D at the Department of Energy. And finally, and I think particularly relevant to Indian country, there is a call for planning, permitting, and building a range of critical infrastructure, a lot of emphasis, especially on the need to build new transmission lines, long distance transmission lines in particular, in order to move that new carbon-free electricity from the parts of the country where it's generated to other parts of the country where it will be needed. As I say, none of the technology goals I think should be terribly surprising, and they parallel a whole range of studies that have recently been published about what's needed to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. I think one of the things that's particularly important about this Academy's report, however, is that in addition to the technology goals, we had a large fraction of the committee that were social scientists and experts in energy justice, and that resulted in the full and complete inclusion of social and economic considerations into this report, which is very rare for a National Academy study. Some of you may be familiar with the last major National Academies study on decarbonization, America's Energy Future, which came out in 2009. And that report was purely an engineering analysis of the technologies and their readiness levels, if you will. This report, by contrast, has extensive social and economic recommendations that relate to our belief that the energy transition and decarbonization of the US energy sector are not merely a technology problem. In fact, we say very explicitly in the report that we need to understand what's coming in terms of a large-scale economic transformation of the United States. And as a result, alongside the technology goals, we need to establish a set of important social and economic goals for the country as part of decarbonization, and recognize that these goals are as critical as carbon neutrality to a successful transition. And those include strengthening the US economy, and I'll say more about these in detail in a minute, promoting equity and inclusion, supporting communities, businesses, and workers, and maximizing cost effectiveness. And I want to focus the rest of my time on these goals because I think they're a particularly important element of thinking about decarbonization in relationship to Indian country. So let me highlight for you that the report recommends a comprehensive policy framework designed to ensure that the transition to carbon neutrality is a just transition. And that includes 4 elements, which I will go through in a little bit more detail. The first is to strengthen US capacity to ensure a just transition. And that includes 3 components: assessing the social and economic impacts of the transition, providing transparent information to communities, workers, businesses, and leaders in as far in advance as possible, and then ultimately holding US policy accountable for fair and equitable processes and outcomes. Sorry that those words are not in there. We call, for example, for establishing a 2-year national transition task force that would be specifically tasked with doing a major assessment of the vulnerabilities of US workers and communities to a variety of different aspects of the transition, including employment, economic base, and public revenues. We call for establishing metrics and standards for an equitable transition and creating a White House office that would be charged with measuring progress against those metrics and standards, for funding social science research and the building of additional capacity and screening tools for the nation's environmental and energy justice decision-making. Second, we call for proactively supporting communities and workers that are impacted by the transition, such as those at the Navajo Nation. We call for investing in clean energy jobs and manufacturing, education, and economic deployment, and providing direct support for those that need it the most. We call for 2 major new economic development institutions that would focus specifically on justice issues in the transition, including a national transition corporation that would be funded to work specifically with and create a kind of one-stop shop for communities and workers impacted by the transition. We call for establishing a green bank that would fund renewable energy investments. And we call for appropriate labor standards and procurement standards to be set, and for comprehensive education and training programs. Third, we call for leveraging the opportunity afforded by the transition to confront and redress injustice, to address the needs of Black, Indigenous, people of color, low income, and other disadvantaged communities. This includes setting rules and practices for inclusive participation in energy transition decision-making, funding investments of a variety of different sorts, including electrification on tribal lands and broadband access, encouraging philanthropies to address racial justice and equity disparities in their funding, and importantly, inclusive public participation in the siting of decarbonization infrastructure, which is going to be significant, that infrastructure development. Fourth, we call for supporting and coordinating action by local, state, tribal, and regional policymakers. Navigating the transition will be complex and decision makers will need help. And so we call for investing in community block grants that support transition planning, in establishing state energy transition offices and regional centers to coordinate regional transitions. And then importantly for me, we call for investing in applied data modeling and knowledge infrastructures that are focused on the questions that decision makers have about transitions and not just cutting edge research. And finally, let me just say that we recommend and call for all stakeholders involved in the energy transition to systematically engage the public to take action to strengthen public support for US decarbonization. We believe that a robust social contract is essential if the US is to accelerate the technological and economic transformation necessary to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. I have some links to the report here. I will put them in the chat as the others speak, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here this morning.
Thank you, Clark, for the bird eye view on energy, on decarbonizing our economy by 2050, but also for providing a list of really actionable, specific policies that could be considered in the next decade by policymakers, federal, state, and others. So we will take all the questions in the end, but feel free to start using the chat, dear audience. And we will shortlist the questions, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. I would now like to welcome Maggie.
Great, thank you, Anna, and thank you for having me here today. Let's see if, let's also set this up. Okay, is that screen visible? Great. So Anna, as Anna mentioned, I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and I also, I am the business development manager at Ranger Power, which is a utility scale solar developer, developing mainly in the Midwest United States. Prior to Ranger Power, I was at Yale School of Environment, where I specifically focused on renewable energy and economic development with tribes. And at that point, my studies really highlighted a great opportunity to address energy poverty and climate change impacts, while clearly positioning tribes as profitable leaders in the nation's renewable energy transition. So today I want to focus on some of these opportunities for tribes to contribute to decarbonization. What are the barriers that exist to actually actualizing this? And then what are some initial ideas for solutions to address those barriers? But let's first give a little background. I want to provide a little background and context to tribal sovereignty and federal Indian trust responsibility, which really frames a lot of the barriers that tribes face in developing renewable energy. So there are over 570 federally recognized tribal governments in the US. So bear in mind, this is not monolithic. This is not a prescription. The presentation is not a prescription. In the US, federal government started to sign treaties with government on a government to government level until 1871, and then started treating tribes as domestic dependent nations, subject to federal law, but not state law. A lot of these tribes, they retained tribal sovereignty, which meant that the tribe possesses the right to form their own governments, to enforce laws, both civil and criminal, within their lands, to tax, to establish requirements for membership, to license and regulate activities, to zone their lands, and to even exclude persons from tribal territories. Tribal reservation land, however, is held in trust for Indians by the federal government. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is responsible for over 55 million acres of land and holds this in trust for tribal nations. While this goal, the goal of this policy was originally to keep Indians contained to certain lands, now it's shifted more to preserving these lands for indigenous peoples. But unfortunately, the effect is similar. Tribes and Indians can't own land if it's under federal trust. So it prevents building equity, financial equity. Let's jump into the opportunities. So according to a 2018 study by NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, tribes could provide 10% of the nation's total energy, as well as 6.7% of US renewable energy capacity, despite only comprising 5.8% of the lower 48 states landmass. So clearly a disproportionate positive impact on renewable energy generation in the US. But despite this generative potential, over 14% of households on Native American reservations lack access to electricity. For example, an estimated 15,000 households on the 55,000 household nation of the Navajo Nation lack access to electricity. And Chéri's going to jump more into a lot of these energy poverty issues. Further, according to the US Department of Energy, 86% of American Indian lands, 15 million acres, with energy or mineral resources were still undeveloped as of 2012. So why is this? And there's a great, actually, there's a great tool, NREL's Tribal Energy Atlas. You can go onto their website and see generation potential, existing energy infrastructure and transmission infrastructure throughout Indian country. So here's a little snapshot of the Navajo Nation as an inset on the US. Similarly, they provide wind resources, as well as distributed solar and distributed scale renewable energy. But not only are there enormous energy opportunities, there are clear benefits for tribes. Tansky Claremont, the director of Grid Alternatives Tribal Solar Accelerator Fund, said, the relationship between renewable and solar energy and sovereignty is the overarching responsibility to protect the land in a way that aligns with cultural and traditional principles while affirming the inherent power of tribal nations. And this is feeding into what Clark discussed and what we're seeing in the renewable energy space, even as private developers, that corporations and municipalities are not only driving renewable procurement and 100% renewable energy goals in the US, they're also driving minority women-owned business procurement standards. And further, they're increasingly looking to achieve social, racial, and environmental justice goals, including through renewable energy procurement. And there's a clear case for renewable energy development in Indian country, displacing fossil fuels, adjusting climate change, creating economic development opportunities, providing for poverty alleviation or energy cost savings potentially, and also as a expression of tribal sovereignty and a way to develop and zone and manage land. So given this enormous, tribes also, I think, Clark alluded to this, that tribes have a long history of resource extraction and exploitation on their land. So energy and economic benefit cannot just be extracted from Indian country, but must benefit tribal members. It's not enough to say that private or non-native companies can come in and develop projects and simply pay lease payments. Tribes are increasingly wanting to be more active, wanting to be more than more than lease their land. They're looking at ways to develop, own, and generate renewable energy projects while providing job training opportunities, employment opportunities, and supply chain opportunities. And given this enormous opportunity and untapped generative capacity on tribal lands, tribes can and should be key to the transition away from fossil fuels, transforming the challenges of the climate crisis into wealth building opportunities. But an energy paradox lingers in Indian country, clearly. Enormous potential, but numerous barriers to development and high rates of unelectrified homes. So here's a quick, a simplified diagram of the renewable energy development process. For tribal development, barriers unfortunately exist across the spectrum. So this includes accessing capital, limited technical expertise and transmission infrastructure, regulatory complexity, minimal knowledge of sovereignty and federal Indian law amongst businesses and financial institutions. So even from site identification, identifying your site, controlling the site area, and working with landowners, to applying for your transmission and to your interconnection position with your transmission provider, and then applying for permits at different levels of government, all the way through conducting your environmental assessments and creating a mitigation plan, and identifying buyers and off-takers for the power. So as I alluded, land is held in trust or under the control of the federal government, which virtually means all these decisions related to land, including mineral and energy development, must be approved by the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the Secretary of the Interior. While important for reducing the transfer of tribal lands to private non-Indian ownership, it cannot be sold or used as collateral, which makes it difficult to build equity and use as a capital for capital raising. Further, it's encumbered by federal regulations and red tape. And additionally, with fragmented, we see a lot of fragmented ownership. So due to deliberate US policies and private actions, legal jurisdictions and land tenure can vary widely across reservations, creating this complicated mosaic of private lands, individual trust lands, tribal trust lands, and navigating this process, both in terms of gaining site control as well as gaining regulatory approvals, is complicated to say the least, and really makes energy development difficult. Further, most tribal lands are located in rural, isolated areas, which often make renewable energy development and transmission and distribution infrastructure challenging and financially infeasible. Even if there is transmission and distribution infrastructure, we still need high voltage transmission to connect this generation to low demand in more populated areas. Additionally, tribal governments may not even be represented when this infrastructure is sited in the first place. And one result of the federal Indian trust responsibility is that tribal lands are subject to a number of federal regulations, including the National Environmental Protection Act. Permitting processes, forms of agency, and oversight that are not required on private lands. And this nexus means that even under environmental review, that non-tribal members, non-Indians, have a say in comments over the environmental impacts on tribal lands, which clearly undermines tribal sovereignty. And there's few existing frameworks for the development of projects, such as permitting, siting, contracts that exist for these unique tribal contexts. So this really increases the complexity, risk, uncertainty, and time horizon of a lot of these projects. And here's a little map of some of the agencies that these projects would have to go through under the Department of the Interior. And finally, in a survey of experts in the field, Sandia National Laboratories found that finance was the biggest barrier to renewable energy development on tribal lands. Tribes are largely locked out of a vast global private and public equity market. For example, tribal Section 17 corporations that were created to extend business formation rights to tribes are prohibited from transferring corporate assets to non-tribal entities, including ownership shares, without the direct and explicit permission from the Department of the Interior. So that really reduces outside investment from public equity markets. Second, under the Securities and Exchange Commission Regulation D, tribes are not included in the definition of an accredited investor. Accredited investors are exempt from meeting state and federal security registration requirements in order to participate in private equity markets. So again, another source of capital is really hamstrung from tribes being able to use it. And finally, as tax-exempt entities, tribes and their corporations are ineligible to monetize or transfer production and investment tax credits, which have been incredibly helpful for driving renewable energy development and reducing costs to renewable energy development for solar and wind. And there's also, additionally, there's limited capacity, both, in terms of few regulatory frameworks exist to develop these programs. And energy companies can find it difficult, and tribes difficult to draft necessary development documents to enact and really carry through projects on tribal lands. So few potential solutions. Obviously it doesn't span the gamut, but I think it's particularly interesting and a particularly good point right now, as we've heard that, on the campaign trail, Biden claim climate change and economic development inseparable issues, and announced a $2 trillion climate plan to promote these goals. And recently, we've seen the confirmation of Deb Haaland as a first Native American to serve as Secretary of Interior. So it's a pressing time to push these initiatives forward. And I should note that not all of these efforts lie with tribes or the federal government. Developers, should have patient capital. Philanthropic and private capital must similarly step up and build trust by understanding respecting tribal sovereignty and colonial history. So on the land front, a recommendation is to address fragmented ownership, for example, in the approval process, the lengthy approval process, is to modernize the federal trust responsibility. While there's been recent legislation to increase tribal authority and to enter land lease agreements and streamline processes for energy development, there's still a lot of red tape. It's lengthy and bureaucratic. So we need to discover a balance between this federal trust responsibility and tribal sovereignty, and enacting streamlined permitting and regulatory processes on tribal land. We can support responsible tribal environmental analysis and land use regulations in lieu of federal requirements, and reduce burdensome processes required under the Hearth Act, which was an application for tribes to enter long-term leases without continuous Secretary of Interior approval, and to put these projects on an accelerated and prioritized federal approval process. On the financing side, we need to band together. Tribes need to form coalitions and approach the administration and approach for federal policy change, increase funding. We should create a cash in lieu of tax credits, tax deferrals, et cetera, for tribes who are unable to monetize these incentives. We need to add tribal governments to the definition of accredited investors to increase the access to private equity markets. And as Clark mentioned, a tribal green bank. We need to aggregate a lot of the existing resources that exist, but also increase that funding to accelerate energy development and energy supply chains in Indian country. In terms of infrastructure, we need immediate direct investment in tribal communities for electrification, including temporary generators, water infrastructure, sanitation, to address basic healthcare needs, particularly pressing during the COVID pandemic. We need to see federal subsidization for transmission and distribution in Indian country, as well as between Indian country and large load centers, deeming them renewable energy zones. Where that's not feasible, microgrids and distributed generation need to be created to extend electrification to all households. And we need to leverage public, private, and utility investments to establish opportunities for further wealth building opportunities to allow tribes to have equity investment within transmission infrastructure, for example. There's some ideas in terms of why don't we create tribal energy solicitations, encouraging federal and state RPS and renewable energy goals to be met with renewable energy generation from tribal lands, including a tribal preference for employment. Creating, again, areas for concentrated investment in renewable energy investment zones, and increasing efforts and standards to include tribal representation on utility boards, and in particular co-ops and munis in tribal territory. Additional technical assistance is still required. One issue cited often by developers is discontinuity in leadership and administrations at tribes, and also being able to enter secure transactions. So funding to programs that work with tribal governments on governance and institution building, There's numerous ones that exist from University of Arizona to Harvard to Portland State University. Further, as I was saying earlier, tribes are not looking just to receive lease payments. We need multi-sector support for workforce and renewable energy services development, or trade and associations to build this tribal supply chain network. And legal, we need to figure out and establish more frameworks and more templates for permitting, siting, drafting, and drafting contracts within a unique tribal context. For example, we could create a legal template for tribal public-private partnerships for these new business models. And there's a number, we have a number of efforts across the country, particularly related to development in Indian country. So support of additional business models would go a long way to accelerating renewable energy development on tribal lands. And we'll wait for the questions for later.
Thank you, Maggie. When you were talking about the complexities, I started thinking that, oh my goodness, so many different aspects that need coordination. And then you did provide a list of very possible and very actionable solutions. Thank you for that. And now, having talked about barriers, it's my pleasure to welcome Chéri, who is working on the solutions. She's the boots on the ground. Her initiative has successfully overcome some of these barriers that were addressed before. And I also wanted to mention that she's a descendant of the Mi'kmaq Nation in northern Maine. And Chéri, please take it away. I can't hear you, Chéri, at this point.
Muted, sorry. Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much. And thank you to IAEE for inviting me to be a part of this webinar and to participate here with my esteemed colleagues. I'm gonna share my screen and pray that it works. Are you seeing it? Okay, again, my name is Chéri Smith. I am CEO and founder of Covenant Solar Initiative, which is currently a fiscally sponsored project of Earth Island Institute, 501c3. We are in the process of establishing our own 501c, which we should have later this year. Can you all see my screen? Yeah, all right. So imagine for a moment that you've just learned from Maggie about many of the barriers to renewable energy development for tribes, and of course the opportunities and some wonderful potential solutions to those, overcoming those barriers. Imagine that for a second though, that you're a tribal council president and you're looking at that list of solutions and that unwieldy development process. If you're like most, you've an anecdotal understanding of what renewable energy is, but it's highly unlikely that you understand the complex development contraptions and mind-boggling financial mechanisms necessary to bring it to your people. So you add to that an innate distrust of the federal government, of utilities, of corporate America, and you're scared to death, which is therein lies the primary reason why I was compelled to gather together my extraordinary team and found this organization to help address head-on those opportunities and those barriers, and that Maggie spoke about, and the almost perfect scenario Clark described for making a just transition, and to help develop workarounds until the policy catches up. That's what our initiative is about. And so I'd like to share with you some excerpts, just a very brief excerpts from a longer documentary we're working on about the Northern Cheyenne and the Standing Rock Sioux tribes and other tribes in Indian country in the Northern Plains. This features the The first residential solar demonstration project that we did as a team on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation for Elsie Weaselbear, who is a tribal elder. You'll meet some of our team and you'll hear their thoughts on why this initiative is so needed from our executive director, Otto Braided Hair, and his daughter, Vanessa. You can see Vanessa right here laughing with the sun on her shirt. Her efforts as a young woman at 19 years old were largely responsible for Arch Coal's withdrawal of their 40-year-old mine and railroad proposal. So let's just take a look. Oop, it didn't play. Let's see if I can get it to play.
People have been struggling for centuries, and been under pressures from that Western expansion, even to the day.
Here on Standing Rock, we pay some of the highest utility rates, more than double compared to the rest of the state of North Dakota. We experience some of the coldest winters and the harshest winds you can ever imagine.
You know, it means so much more than just saving some money. It means so much more than just divesting from coal. It means saving my people. That's what energy independence means to me.
When you hear that word extinction, you think about all the campaigns and all the money that is spent preventing animals, plants, bugs from going extinct. And these are people.
I grew up with the saying, you know, mehadas, you know, we take care of each other. You know, that's what solar is going to bring. We'll be able to take care of each other.
This initiative touches on much more than energy. It's about restoring vitality.
Our way of life is closely connected to the environment, the plants and animals, water of life.
Bringing renewable energy, I feel, will empower our people to do something more, will empower our people to be better in this life and to help us flourish out of poverty.
The role of Covenant is to build the capacity of Native American tribes to develop and deploy and train their people in all aspects of solar themselves. Their self-sufficiency is restored, vibrancy is restored, and the money that is not being spent on dirty fossil fuel energy flows back into the community.
That means more money for food. That means more funding towards emergency services. It means more money towards education.
It's really what our people want. That's all they wanted, to be able to protect our tribe and families, and they wanted to be left alone to live.
You know, we've already been through so much, and I know we're strong, but we need to tap into that warrior within and empower ourselves and say, hey, no, our lives are so important, and our people are important, our way is important, and our homelands are important, and we need to take care of that. We'll be solar independent, I know. We will.
Okay. Sadly, we lost Elsie to COVID in November. She was a fierce opponent of coal development and advocate for preserving the Cheyenne way of life and homelands for future generations. And we are naming and dedicating the residential portion of our program to her memory. So if you weren't already aware, you're now awakened to just some of the challenges faced by our Indigenous people. But if we were to try and condense the story of what has been perpetrated on American Indians since first contact, we couldn't do it justice, so we won't even try. These are but a few of the challenges that they face. So what's energy got to do with this problem? As Maggie mentioned, 14% of Native households don't have access to electricity, which is sometimes referred to as energy poverty. As you just saw in the film, for those that do have access, discriminatory pricing practices by utilities result in rates that are sometimes double the amount paid by non-natives right next door, literally right over the reservation line. Ooh, I think I skipped a page. So there's no mistake here. You are looking at nothing because I want us to focus on some critical facts. 1 in 3 American Indians lives in poverty in our country. With almost 3 million natives living here in the US, that's almost 1 million human beings living in poverty here in our own country. These exorbitant energy costs imposed on them, which is a little known form of discrimination, force many native families of the Great Plains into this plight of heat or eat. So each winter, natives on reservations of the Northern Plains resort to burning things indoors to keep warm. Trash, tires, wood is scarce and expensive. And when they run out of things to burn, some die of exposure to cold in their own homes, too proud to ask for help. And sometimes there is no help, not even from the tribes themselves, because they don't have it. This happens every winter right here in the United States of America. Covenant was formed to eradicate that form of energy poverty, this form caused by blatant racism. The bright news is a convergence of conditions is creating a profound opportunity at this point in time and a powerful way for us to intervene in a meaningful way. First, by reducing the amount of money spent on electricity, we can stop that deadly cycle we just talked about and provide a means for Native families to afford other essentials like food and medicine and clothing. Second, despite the tremendous economic pressures to mine the coal under their feet or to drill the oil or to frack the gas, many American Indian tribes like the Cheyenne and the Sioux have, despite the fighting internally between their tribal council members and individual members, they have resisted and voted for 2 generations now to resist that additional fossil fuel development out of an obligation that they feel as natives to protect their homelands and preserve their cultural identity. And third, even though the fossil fuel industry continues to battle against renewables, we're fighting SB 237 in Montana right now and others in South Dakota, it's incessant. The fact is, as Maggie described, solar energy is incredibly abundant resource, renewable energy in general, wind, biomass, hydro, solar in native regions. But solar for us is the cheapest form and it's more accessible than ever. So we believe that this perfect storm of these 3 factors has the potential to spark an enduring shift in the economic, the social, and the ecological systems of American Indian communities. So, as do an increasing number of American Indian leaders. Being reliant on the very government who put your people in this predicament in the first place is difficult, to say the least, but it's completely counter to the native ethos of self-determination. So this is Otto Braided Hair, whom you met in the film. Otto is a spiritual leader of the Northern Cheyenne tribe, and until he just last week left his decade of tenure as the director of the Northern Cheyenne Fire Department. He was in charge of protecting 450,000 acres from the wildfires that run rampant. His tribe needed him in that role, and he spent 5 years training up his successor so that he could transition to working no longer on a volunteer basis, but a full-time basis with us. And in his words, for eons, my people were self-reliant. The earth provided for all of our needs. The devastating effects of colonization, westward expansion, manifest destiny, and the destruction of our economy by colonists, meaning the extermination of the buffalo, stripped us of our ability to provide for ourselves, causing us to be reliant on outsiders for our survival. Blatant discrimination by utilities compounds the challenges we face. This initiative offers us and other tribes what may be our last chance to regain our sovereignty and self-reliance. So how do we fix this? Our theory of change is to sort of leapfrog over all of those federal and colonial constructs that are the barriers, the major barriers to energy, renewable energy development on sovereign lands, and take a grassroots approach. If we take a systems-based approach, building capacity for American Indian tribes to eliminate energy-related poverty in their communities, weaving together expertise in solar technology, economic and workforce development, and systems development, then ultimately tribal self-sufficiency is strengthened, sovereignty is preserved, and sacred covenants to preserve and protect Mother Earth are fulfilled. So our approach is quite different. This is my friend Leon. He's an Arapaho tribal member. And while solar projects have been undertaken on various reservations, most of these projects are driven by the economic return for outside investors who typically provide the capital to build solar and then extract most of the value of the solar system over its life. In other cases, donated projects are being built by nonprofits, and tribes are sidelined by the outsiders who are doing all the work. And don't get me wrong, these provide value. We use them ourselves as demonstrations for tribes to earn trust and to see what the technology can do, but they don't make progress towards lasting change and self-determination. So our approach is vastly different. And it is possible to leapfrog some of those barriers. For example, we're doing a 2 megawatt project on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation using DOE funds, but we keep it to 2 megawatts for the utility scale. It's called the Morningstar Array because that uses less than 10 acres of land. 10 acres is the trigger point for an EPA environmental assessment. So we keep it smaller than that. We don't have to get them involved, and we don't have to get BIA involved, but we can talk about all that, those details at another day. So our approach is to partner solar expertise with native leadership to establish robust and financially regenerative solar education, solar deployment ecosystems. We convene knowledge from broad disciplines to build the capacity of tribes to build and maintain solar themselves. Assist them in facilitating beneficial financial transactions that avoid those issues that Maggie was discussing about access to capital, and form collaborations with entities that can help them do that and advocate against these discriminatory utility practices. Establishing new economies by establishing native-owned solar cooperatives that will build these projects. And eventually the goal is to establish native-owned utilities and jobs and an economy in solar and other renewables eventually for native people to serve their own communities. So a bit about our inspiration. Our inspiration comes from the tribes who reached out and sought our help to guide them on these solar journeys. Our primary tribal partner and the host of our pilot programs dating back to the early 2000s for a subset of us is the Northern Cheyenne tribe in Southeastern Montana. It's also the home of our executive director, Auto Braided Hair. In 2014, following a 40-year battle to keep Arch Coal's proposed mine and railroad from destroying their homelands, the Northern Cheyenne Tribal Council, despite being torn by the lure of those riches under their feet and the pull of their sacred covenants to preserve the earth, they passed a unanimous resolution to pursue renewable energy development and forsake fossil fuel development forever. A member of the council said to us at that time, "We have been voting no to coal for 2 generations. We need something to say yes to." So in the wake of this momentous action taken by the tribe, the team that is now Covenant was invited to help them pursue clean energy for their people. In 2016, the world watched as the Standing Rock Sioux tribe stood in the path of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which threatens their homelands, drinking water, sacred sites. Tribes from all over the country, you can see them lined up here. You can see the Northern Cheyenne flag there in the middle as well, came to support them. We are honored to be partnered with Cody Two Bears and the Standing Rock community in pursuing solar as an alternative energy source. Cody is now our director of development. He founded a nonprofit called Indigenized Energy on Standing Rock, which Covenant has taken on as a fiscal sponsor. So our regenerative approach is focused on whole systems thinking. Covenant secures resources from donors and impact investors and other sources of financing to support Indigenous communities, solar energy development. Our core function is to develop the capacity of tribes to plan, design, and manage renewable energy on their own. Then in partnership with tribes, we invest in renewable energy systems at various scales, including residential, commercial, and utility scale systems in a way that reduces poverty, creates jobs, and cultivates economic development. Over time, we recapture some of the value from solar energy generation to regenerate our ability to continue work. And the main instrument we developed was we couldn't have done the financial modeling without the help of Maggie Tallmadge here with us and her fellow grad students at CBay a few years back. Our main instrument is a revolving fund that will be structured just like other successful solar industry finance tools, but it prevents having to deal with that federal mess and the corporate finance mess. This fund is also how we'll eliminate those Wall Street bank approaches in lieu of a fund that is managed jointly by the tribes that we're working with. The role of the fund is to secure impact investment, issue securities to repay investors, plan and implement renewable project investments, manage energy generation resources, and grow the fund to build capacity to invest in new projects. Most importantly, the largest portion of revenue from solar generation is put back into more solar installations. This is how every dollar stays in the community, gets multiplied, and how the benefits of solar are shared with the whole community. The way we'll do this is through the establishment of special purpose entities that allow tribes to, it's an interim step, like I said, until the policy catches up and some of those cash in lieu of tax credits can come into place. Establishing special purpose vehicles for the tribes to benefit from those tax credits is critical to getting work done now and not waiting until that time. So tribes can't do this alone, and we recognize that we can't either. So we rely on a group of trusted partners, some of whom are represented here. And one of the most important roles we serve is one of vetting authority and a buffer between tribes and the colonial business practices, which often cause stress and misunderstandings. So I think I'm out of time, more than out of time. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Anna. Thank you so much. Anyone can email me here with any questions.
Thank you, Chéri. We are actually not on a strict timeline. IE has generously mentioned that we can keep going and all the recordings will be on YouTube. So for the audience, if you necessarily have to drop off, don't despair, because you will be able to see the recordings later. And of course, all of the contacts of our speakers are up. So feel free to follow up on all of these discussions. And then also, if speakers are comfortable, their slides will be shared on IAE webpage. So we'll have access to all of that. And I can see already questions pouring in. I'd also want to appreciate for a second all the different approaches that have been presented to us. So it's clear that Clark and the National Academies of Sciences were looking at more of a federal approach of how to make a dent in decarbonization. Maggie's approach were a mix of, if I'm allowed to say, probably investors / utility, and Chéri's approach is more of a grassroots, empowering the communities themselves to make the change. So I would like to just stop for a second, appreciate all of the possibilities that we have to make this difference, and all the people who work on these different levels to make that difference. So thank you for everybody who submitted questions. I would like to first direct a question to you, Chéri, because it's a very pointed question from Jen Ruda of the Seventh Skyline LLC, which is an energy consultancy working with Western tribes. Jen is asking whether, Chéri, you have been, or Covenant Solar, have been able to successfully help tribes approach developing their own tribal utilities or co-ops, and wondering whether these are best suited for larger tribes with larger loads, or whether small tribes with smaller loads could be also candidates.
Great question. We are in the formative stages of this work and of this organization. And so we have not done so yet. We have not established any tribal utilities, but I can tell you that the interest is incredible. The list of tribes that are lining up to want to work with us to help pursue that is getting longer. Currently, Northern Cheyenne, Standing Rock Sioux, and Chippewa Cree tribes are actively engaged with us in the beginning stages of pursuing that. And there have been tribes that are successful in doing it. We don't have time to get into it, but I'd love to have a conversation with you offline, Jen, about that. And to answer the question about demand, the Chippewa Cree, they're tiny and have low demand. The benefits to a tribe to be energy sovereign, size doesn't matter. It's if they want that goal, we'll help them pursue it.
There's another very interesting question about carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology that hasn't been mentioned by any of the speakers. So any of the speakers who are interested in responding to that question are welcome to do so. So the question refers back to the great natural gas endowments on many reservations and whether CCUS could and should be an option that should be considered. Would any of you want to take that question? Clark?
I don't know that I have a good answer for it. The committee spent a fair bit of time looking at CO2 capture issues. This report doesn't do a lot on CO2 capture because this report is, and I didn't mention this and I apologize, is the first of two reports from the committee, the second of which will come out in 2022. This report covers the first decade, so 2020 to 2030, and the next report gets us out to 2050. And from the committee's perspective was not a lot to be done on carbon capture and storage in the 2020s, except for planning. And the report does recommend that the federal government, that Congress make plans for looking at the development of carbon storage reservoirs, studying potential reservoirs, and studying what would be needed for a CO2 pipeline network if you were going to develop carbon capture and storage technologies. And so those are both studies that need to be done in the next 5 to 10 years in order to make plans if we decided to build out a substantial CO2 pipeline network for what would be needed and where it would need to go in the 2030s. So that's where the committee was. The committee's view was that CCS may ultimately be important for some portion, particularly of point source emitters of carbon dioxide, and particularly heavy industry, and maybe also the electric power sector. But now, taking off my committee hat, the challenges for CCS are real in the sense that it is, whether you do it point source and you capture at the source, or you do it through direct air capture, it is a significant added expense on the energy system. I was looking at coal the other day. It could potentially double or even more the price of coal-powered electricity to try to do CCS, which obviously makes the economics of CCS really challenging as we go forward, which is why I think the committee saw a relatively limited role in the heavy industry space. I also know that EPRI is conducting a low carbon research initiative going forward, and their modeling work that they recently released also does not show a significant contribution in the power sector for natural gas with CCS because of the economics. So it's an important question, but also, you know, a really challenging issue.
Thank you, Clark. Any other speakers would like to chime in? If not, I have another question for you, and that'll be the last question for this webinar. Clark already had a chance to respond, so I will give the chance for Maggie or Chéri to share their views. The question is how to make some of the solutions that you proposed politics proof. It's a challenging question.
I think that's an interesting one. So I think there is a bit of a incorrect view of politics for Indian country. I mean, if we're looking at U.S. federal politics, I think Republicans have been very supportive of tribal sovereignty, tribal renewable energy development, tribal energy development in the past. So I don't think it's a Democrat versus Republican divide. It's a conversation of economic development, energy development, and respecting tribal sovereignty. So we need the funding first and foremost for these efforts. But if the question was insinuating that maybe the conservative side would be less supportive, I don't think that's an accurate assessment. I think it is definitely, I think tribal renewable energy development is not a partisan issue.
Thank you, Maggie, on this view. Chéri.
I would agree with Maggie on that point. The level that we see pushback on tribal energy is at the state level and the utilities. State level Republicans are pushing policy that is just blatantly discriminatory. I won't burden this conversation with the specific bills, but in Montana and North Dakota right now, there are two that blatantly stop renewable energy development in its tracks if they're enabled, and they forgive multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars in penalties for not adhering to renewable standards. So there is that going on at the state level. I think the way to avoid politics in general, and as Maggie alluded to in her presentation, even tribal politics are difficult because the administrations, they change 50% every 2 years. So you've got different leadership. It's to develop standards and practices within tribes themselves so that they can govern themselves consistently and understand how to face these challenges that come from state level.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to close the webinar and thank our speakers for their time, for their insights. I would like to thank our audience. The recording will be online. Please share it with your friends and colleagues who need to hear this message. And back to you, Dave.
Thank you, Anna. IAEE wishes to thank Chéri, Maggie, and Clark for just really a fascinating webinar. I was aware, but not nearly as aware of the complexities around this issue. So I'm very grateful for your time and your expertise. Would love to see a follow-up to this. Much to be said, to be researched. You know, politics, yikes, how do you address that? You know, it's such a thick topic all the way around in our energy industries, and most probably a very complex situation in the Indian nation. So thank you once again. The rewind will be on our website this afternoon. We encourage your friends and colleagues to plug in to check this out, and I officially close this webinar.